The clinking of champagne glasses was the only sound that could penetrate the thick, warm bubble of my contentment. 40 years. 40 years since my husband, Michael, and I had opened the doors to the Gilded Spoon, a small bakery born from nothing more than a bag of flour and a shared dream. Now, I stood in the center of our grand, expanded cafe, surrounded by the laughter of friends, the loyalty of longtime employees, and the proud gaze of my only son, Daniel. My heart felt full to bursting. Michael had been gone for 2 years now, a sudden, cruel absence that had left a hole in my world. But his spirit was everywhere tonight. It was in the sweet, buttery scent of croissants that hung in the air, in the familiar worn texture of the wooden countertops, and in the framed photograph on the wall of him and me, covered in flour and grinning on our opening day. I was 68 years old, and this bakery was not just my business. It was the story of my life. Daniel tapped a fork against his glass, calling for silence. The happy chatter died down, and all eyes turned to him. He stood on the small makeshift stage we'd set up, looking so much like his father in his sharp suit. A wave of love and pride washed over me. He had stepped up after Michael's passing, taking over the business side of things, the spreadsheets and logistics that had always given me a headache. He'd assured me it was too much for me to handle alone, and I, lost in my grief, had been grateful. "Thank you all for coming," Daniel began, his voice smooth and confident. 40 years, it's an incredible milestone, a testament to the hard work and vision of my parents, Catherine and Michael Thorne. He smiled in my direction, and the crowd applauded. I felt a blush rise to my cheeks. "My father built this place with his bare hands," Daniel continued, his voice resonating with practiced sincerity. "And my mother, well, she was the heart of it, the soul. Her recipes, her warmth, they made the Gilded Spoon what it is today, a beloved institution in this community." More applause. I saw Maria, our head baker who had been with us for 30 of those 40 years, wipe a tear from her eye. She raised her glass to me, and I smiled back, my own eyes misty. "But institutions must evolve," Daniel said, his tone shifting subtly. A new, sharper edge entered his voice. "Tradition is a beautiful thing, but it can also be an anchor holding us back from the future, from progress." A ripple of confusion went through the room. I frowned slightly. Where was he going with this? "I have worked tirelessly for the past 2 years not just to maintain my father's legacy, but to build upon it, to ensure its survival for the next 40 years and beyond. And that has led me to make a difficult but necessary decision." He paused for dramatic effect, his eyes sweeping across the crowd. They landed on a man I hadn't noticed before, standing near the back. A man in an impeccably tailored, brutally expensive-looking suit, with a cold, predatory smile. "I'm proud to announce that the Gilded Spoon has been acquired by Sterling Hospitality Group," Daniel declared, his voice booming with a false sense of triumph. The words hit me like a physical blow. Acquired. I stared at him, my mind refusing to process the statement. The friendly chatter was replaced by a stunned, collective gasp. Maria's face had gone pale with shock. Daniel pressed on, his voice accelerating as if to outrun the sudden chill in the room. "This partnership will allow us to modernize, to expand, to bring the brand my parents created to a national stage. Mr. Sterling, the CEO, has assured me that he intends to honor the bakery's history while steering it toward a more profitable and efficient future." My legs felt weak. I gripped the back of a chair to steady myself. This had to be a joke, a horribly unfunny, cruel joke. Daniel wouldn't. He couldn't. We had never spoken of this, not a word. "And what about your mother?" A voice called out from the crowd. It was Mr. Henderson, one of our oldest customers, a retired history professor who came in every morning for his coffee and almond croissant. Daniel's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. He looked at me, and for the first time, I saw not a loving son, but a complete stranger. There was a cold, hard calculation in his eyes that I had never seen before. "My mother," he said, his voice softening into a tone of deep, manufactured concern, "has earned her rest. She's given her entire life to this place. It's time for her to relax and be taken care of, which is why I've also made arrangements for her to move into a beautiful new home at the Silver Pines Senior Living Community, starting tomorrow. The room erupted in a cacophony of shocked murmurs. A retirement home. He was putting me in a retirement home. He was not only selling my life's work from under me, he was evicting me from my own life. The apartment above the bakery, the home where I had raised him, where I had mourned my husband, was no longer mine. The bubble of my contentment didn't just burst, it was annihilated. The warmth in the room was gone, replaced by an arctic cold that seeped into my bones. I saw it all with a horrifying, sudden clarity. The endless papers he'd asked me to sign over the past 2 years, documents he'd dismissed as routine business licenses and tax forms. My hands had been so unsteady with grief, my mind so clouded, that I had signed whatever he'd put in front of me, trusting him completely. The power of attorney. The ownership transfer. He had been planning this all along. He finished his speech with some empty platitudes about a new era of excellence, but I didn't hear them. I was frozen, a statue in the middle of the ruins of my own life. The man in the expensive suit, Mr. Sterling, was now making his way through the crowd toward me. He moved with the slick, unhurried confidence of a shark. As he approached, a slow smile spread across my face. It must have looked strange, insane even amidst the wreckage of my world. But in that moment of absolute betrayal, as the ground crumbled beneath my feet, my mind latched onto a memory, a detail. A secret my dear, methodical husband had insisted upon years ago, a secret so small and seemingly insignificant that my brilliant, progressive son had undoubtedly overlooked it in his rush to sell his mother's soul. Daniel thought he had sold the gilded spoon. Mr. Sterling thought he had bought it. But what they didn't know was that they had only purchased the shell. The name, the building. Because the heart of the bakery, the true source of its magic and its value, was not listed on any deed or in any asset column. It was hidden away, safe in a place only I knew. And without it, the gilded spoon was nothing more than a name on a building full of ovens. The game was not over. It had just begun. Mr. Sterling reached me, his hand outstretched, his smile a veneer of corporate charm over a core of pure steel. "Catherine," he said, his voice smooth as polished marble. "An absolute honor. Your son has told me so much about you. I'm Jonathan Sterling. I look forward to being the new custodian of your husband's incredible legacy." He used the word custodian, but his eyes said conqueror. He looked around the room at the warm wood, the display cases filled with pastries, the mural of the French countryside Michael and I had painted by hand one summer. He wasn't seeing a legacy of love. He was seeing a brand to be exploited, a property to be flipped. I didn't take his hand. I simply looked at him, letting my strange, serene smile linger. His own smile tightened at the edges, a flicker of annoyance in his cold, gray eyes at my refusal to play the part of the gracious, defeated old woman. "The legacy of this bakery, Mr. Sterling," I said, my voice quiet but carrying in the sudden hush that had fallen over the immediate area, "is not something that can be bought or sold. It has to be earned." Before he could respond, Daniel was at my side, his hand gripping my elbow a little too tightly. "Mom, let's not make a scene. Mr. Sterling is our guest. He's the future of this company." "Is he now?" I said, turning to look at my son. I searched his face for any sign of the boy I had raised, the child who had scraped his knee and cried for me, the teenager who I had taught to bake his first loaf of bread in our kitchen. I saw nothing. Only a man I did not know, a man whose ambition had devoured his conscience. "And who decided that, Daniel? Did you make this decision for the both of us?" "I made this decision for the good of the business," he said, his voice low and tense, his grip on my arm a warning. "Something had to be done. We were stagnating. Dad's way of doing things was sentimental. It wasn't profitable. The casual dismissal of his father's life's work was more painful than the sale itself. Michael hadn't cared about maximizing profit margins. He had cared about quality, about community, about the look on a customer's face when they bit into a perfect pain au chocolat. He had known the names of every regular, their children's names, their little joys and sorrows. That was his way of doing things. The party was effectively over. The celebratory atmosphere had curdled into a thick, uncomfortable tension. People were avoiding my eyes, whispering to each other as they collected their coats and slipped out the door. Some gave me looks of pity, others of morbid curiosity. Only a few, my real friends, looked at me with expressions of pure, unadulterated rage on my behalf. Maria, my head baker, was chief among them. She stood by the kitchen doors, her arms crossed, her dark eyes fixed on Daniel like she was ready to wield her rolling pin as a weapon. Daniel, ever the smooth operator, tried to salvage the situation. He began moving around the room, shaking hands with the few remaining guests, speaking loudly about exciting expansion plans and new franchise opportunities. He was a performer, trying to drown out the raw, human tragedy he had just created with the loud, empty noise of business. I felt a gentle touch on my other arm. It was my friend, Alina, a retired librarian whose quiet demeanor hid a spine of solid oak. "Catherine," she whispered, her voice trembling with indignation. "This is monstrous. You cannot let him do this." "I don't intend to," I said, my voice so calm it surprised even myself. "But tonight is not the night for a fight. It's the night for listening." And so I stayed, a ghost at my own wake. I watched Daniel glad-handing Mr. Sterling. I listened to them talk about streamlining production, about replacing our locally sourced butter with cheaper, mass-produced alternatives, about introducing a line of frozen pastries to sell in supermarkets. Every word was a desecration. They were talking about turning my beautiful, artisanal bakery into a soulless factory. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, only a handful of people remained. Daniel, Mr. Sterling, a few of Sterling's corporate sycophants, and my small, loyal circle of friends who refused to leave my side, Alina and Maria. Daniel walked over to me, his face a mask of strained patience. "Mom, it's late. I've arranged for a car to take you to Silver Pines in the morning at 10. They have a lovely suite ready for you. A nurse will help you pack the essentials." He said it so matter-of-factly, as if he were discussing a delivery schedule. He had already arranged everything. My eviction was a done deal, a line item on his project plan. "The essentials," I repeated, the words tasting like ash. "And what about the non-essentials, Daniel? My books, your father's paintings. 40 years of memories packed into that apartment. Are they to be streamlined as well?" "We'll put everything in storage," he said dismissively. "You won't have room for all that clutter at Silver Pines. It's a modern facility, very minimalist." Clutter, he called our life clutter. Mr. Sterling, who had been observing our exchange with an air of detached amusement, finally stepped in. "I'm sure we can be accommodating, Catherine. My team will be taking possession of the building tomorrow at noon. Anything left in the residential unit after that will be disposed of." It was a threat, delivered with a polite, bloodless smile. I looked from my son's cold eyes to the corporate predator he had invited into our lives. They were two sides of the same coin. They saw the world not as a place of love and connection, but as a series of assets to be acquired and liabilities to be disposed of. And tonight, I had been reclassified as a liability. 10 o'clock then, I said, my voice utterly devoid of the emotion that was churning inside me. I turned to Alina and Maria. "Could you walk me home?" I asked, deliberately using the word home one last time. As we walked toward the staircase that led to my apartment, I could feel Daniel's relieved sigh at my seeming capitulation. He thought I had given up. He thought he had won. His arrogance was a cavern, vast and deep. He had inherited his father's intelligence, but none of his wisdom. We climbed the stairs in silence. When we entered my apartment, the familiar comfort of it, the scent of old books and lemon polish, the sight of the worn armchair where Michael used to read, wrapped around me like a shroud. This was the last night I would ever spend here. The grief was a physical weight, pressing down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. "What are you going to do?" Maria asked, her voice a fierce whisper as soon as the door was closed. "We can't let them do this. The staff, we will walk out, all of us. We work for you, Catherine, not for some corporate monster." "No," I said, holding up a hand. "Not yet. A walkout would be a gesture. It would make us feel better for a day, but they would just hire new bakers. I need you all to stay. I need you to watch. I need you to be my eyes and ears." Maria looked confused but nodded, her loyalty absolute. "Catherine, you must call a lawyer," Elena urged, her practical mind already working. "This can't be legal. He tricked you into signing those papers." "He did," I agreed. "And proving that I was an emotionally compromised widow who didn't read what she was signing will be a long, ugly, and very expensive fight. A fight they are more prepared for than I am. We can't fight them on their battlefield. We have to choose our own." I walked over to the large oak bookshelf that dominated one wall of the living room. It was filled with my collection of cookbooks, a lifetime of culinary exploration. But I wasn't looking for a printed book. My fingers traced the spines until they found a large, leather-bound volume of Shakespeare's tragedies. I pulled it from the shelf. It was heavier than it should have been. I placed it on the coffee table and opened it. The inside had been hollowed out, and nestled within the cut-out pages, safe and sound, was another book. It wasn't a printed book. It was a simple, thick, leather-bound journal, its pages filled with my late husband's elegant, looping handwriting. Its cover was bare, with no title. It didn't need one. This was the heart of the Gilded Spoon. "What is that?" Elena asked, leaning forward. "It's my husband's book," I said, my fingers caressing the worn leather. "But it's not a diary. It's everything. Every original recipe he ever created is in here. The precise formula for our sourdough starter, which is over 50 years old. The unique tempering method for his signature chocolate glaze. The complex 10-day process for candying the citrus peels for our fruitcakes. It's not just a list of ingredients. It's a record of his techniques, his discoveries, his secrets. It's his genius distilled onto paper." Maria's eyes went wide with understanding. "The Bible," she breathed. It was the staff's secret nickname for the mysterious source of Michael's seemingly magical baking prowess. He had always been secretive about his core recipes, even with his most trusted bakers. "Daniel knows this book exists, of course," I continued, my voice growing stronger, the grief being burned away by a rising, righteous anger. "He's been looking for it for 2 years. He thinks it's in a safe deposit box. He doesn't know that Michael gave it to me on our last anniversary and told me to keep it somewhere no one would ever think to look." I looked up at my friends, my eyes hard and clear. "Daniel and Mr. Sterling have bought the ovens, the flour, the sugar, but they haven't bought the magic. Without this book, they can't replicate our most famous products. The brand they paid millions for will be worthless within 6 months. The Gilded Spoon will become just another mediocre coffee shop." A slow, fierce smile spread across Maria's face. "So they have nothing." "They have a name on a sign," I said, closing the secret book with a soft, definitive thud. "And I have the soul of this bakery right here in my hands. The fight isn't about getting the business back, not yet. The fight is about showing them what they actually bought, and I'm going to let them figure it out the hard way." My plan began to form, sharp and clear in my mind. Daniel wanted me to go quietly to a retirement home. Fine, I would go. I would be the model of a defeated, heartbroken old woman. I would let them think they had won. I would let them walk into their new multi-million-dollar acquisition and discover, slowly and painfully, that they had bought a beautiful, gilded, but ultimately empty spoon. The car arrived at precisely 10 o'clock the next morning. It wasn't a taxi, but a sleek, black town car with a uniformed driver, another of Daniel's performative gestures of caring, for the mother he was disposing of. I was waiting on the curb with a single, small suitcase at my feet. It contained a few changes of clothes, my toiletries, and tucked between 2 sweaters my husband's precious book. Alina and Maria were with me, their faces grim. Maria pressed a small, paper-wrapped bundle into my hands. "Pan de news," she whispered. "Walnut bread. Michael's recipe. It was the first thing he had ever taught her to bake. It was a promise, a symbol of their loyalty." As the driver loaded my bag, Daniel's car, a new, obscenely expensive-looking Tesla, pulled up. He got out, dressed in another sharp suit, ready for his first official day as the man who had successfully sold out his family. His wife, Fiona, was with him. She stayed in the car, her perfectly made-up face hidden behind oversized sunglasses, but I could feel the waves of her smug satisfaction from across the street. She had always seen the bakery as a dusty old relic standing in the way of the lavish lifestyle she believed she deserved. Now she had it. "Mom," Daniel said, approaching me with an air of forced solicitude. "You're all ready, I see. Good. I spoke with the director at Silver Pines. They're expecting you. They'll take wonderful care of you." "I'm sure they will," I said, my voice neutral. I refused to give him the satisfaction of my tears or my anger. I would be a placid, gray rock, offering him nothing to push against. "Look, I know this is difficult," he said, gesturing vaguely. He couldn't even bring himself to say the words. "I know I have shattered your life and betrayed my father's memory. But it's for the best. In a few years, you'll see. The brand will be bigger than ever. Dad would have been proud." "Your father was proud of the bread he baked, Daniel," I said softly. "He was proud of knowing his customers by name. I'm not sure he would have understood the value of being a brand." A flicker of irritation crossed his face. My calm compliance was clearly more unsettling to him than a hysterical outburst would have been. He wanted me to be the crazy, emotional mother. It would have made his rational, businesslike betrayal seem more justifiable. "The car is waiting," he said, his tone clipped. "I have to get to the bakery. Mr. Sterling is meeting me for the official handover." "Of course," I said. "You have a very important day ahead of you." I allowed the driver to help me into the car, and I did not look back as we pulled away. I did not look at my son, standing on the sidewalk, or at the large front windows of the bakery that had been my entire world. I looked straight ahead, my hand resting on the suitcase beside me. Silver Pine's senior living community was exactly as I had pictured it, sterile, beige, and smelling faintly of disinfectant and despair. It was less a home and more a high-end waiting room for the afterlife. The suite Daniel had arranged for me was small but clean, with a large window overlooking a perfectly manicured, perfectly soulless garden. I spent the first few days playing my part. I was quiet, polite, and withdrawn. I ate my meals in the communal dining room, listening to the lonely, repetitive stories of the other residents. I allowed the cheerful, patronizing nurses to check on me. I was Catherine Thorne, the poor, heartbroken widow whose ungrateful son had cast her aside. The story, Daniel's version of it, had already made the rounds. I was an object of pity, which suited my purposes perfectly. Meanwhile, Alina was my general, and Maria was my spy. Alina visited every day, bringing me books from the library and updates from the outside world. She had already consulted with a lawyer friend of hers, confirming our initial assessment. A direct legal challenge based on my impaired state of mind, when signing the papers would be an uphill, expensive battle of he said, she said. Our current path, the path of the empty spoon, was far more strategic. Maria called me every night from her home, her voice a low, conspiratorial whisper. The first few days under the new management had been chaotic. "They're like children in a kitchen, Catherine," she reported on the third night. "Mr. Sterling's people came in today. Efficiency experts, they called themselves. They walked around with clipboards, timing how long it took to knead the dough, questioning why we use Belgian chocolate when a domestic brand is 30% cheaper." "What did you tell them?" I asked. I told them that Michael Thorne would rather have sold the ovens for scrap than use cheap chocolate. The little man in the suit wrote, resistant to change, on his clipboard. I smiled. "Good, and the recipes?" "It's a disaster," she said, and I could hear the grim satisfaction in her voice. They found all of your recipe binders, the everyday ones for the muffins and the scones, but they can't find the core formulas. They tried to make the brioche feuilletti today. They followed the recipe in the binder, but without knowing Michael's 3-stage folding technique, it just came out bready, not flaky. One of the corporate chefs tried to make the salted caramel glaze and it seized up on him. He didn't know the secret is a single drop of lemon juice at a precise temperature. And Daniel. He's a mess. He's trying to act like he's in charge, but Sterling's people walk all over him. He keeps asking me where your master recipe book is. I told him I have no idea, that Michael kept all that in his head. He's starting to look desperate. The first cracks were appearing. Daniel and Sterling had assumed that the recipes were part of the bakery's physical assets, like the mixers or the proofing cabinets. They had no concept of intellectual property, of the intangible human element that gave a business its true worth. By the end of the first week, Maria's reports grew more dire for them and more delicious for me. The efficiency experts had mandated changes: cheaper flour, a different brand of yeast, shorter proofing times to increase daily output. "The bread is suffering, Catherine," Maria said, her voice filled with a baker's sorrow. "It doesn't have the same crumb. The crust isn't as crisp. The customers are noticing. Mr. Henderson came in this morning, took one bite of his almond croissant, and just sighed. He told the girl at the counter it tasted disappointed. Disappointed. What a perfect word. The soul of the bakery was leaving it, day by day, loaf by loaf. My days at Silver Pines took on a strange, double quality. Outwardly, I was fading, a quiet old woman lost in her grief. But inwardly, I was a general receiving field reports from a war I was silently waging. I would sit in the bland, sunlit common room, a half-finished puzzle on the table in front of me, and I would be mentally cataloging every misstep the new management was making. My son called me once at the end of the first week. His voice was strained. "Mom, just calling to see how you're settling in." "It's very clean," I said noncommittally. "Good, that's good," he said a little too quickly. There was an awkward pause. I knew what he wanted to ask. I waited, letting the silence stretch. "So, I've been going through some of Dad's old things at the office," he finally said, trying to sound casual. "I can't seem to find that old leather notebook he was always scribbling in, the one with his private recipes. Do you have any idea where it might be?" "A notebook?" I asked, feigning a hazy, elderly confusion. "He had so many notebooks, dear. I'm afraid my memory isn't what it used to be. Why do you ask?" "No reason," he snapped, his frustration breaking through his calm facade. "Just trying to be thorough for the archives." He hung up shortly after. The archives. He was a terrible liar. The second week was when the real trouble began for them. Their first attempt at the bakery's most famous and profitable product, the gilded truffle cake, was a catastrophic failure. It was a complex, multi-day creation involving 3 types of chocolate, a secret infusion of spices, and a meringue so delicate it could collapse if you looked at it the wrong way. Without Michael's book, they were working blind, trying to reverse engineer a masterpiece. They wasted over $500 worth of chocolate, Maria told me, her voice giddy with schadenfreude. The cake didn't set. It was a puddle. Mr. Sterling came down to the kitchen and he was displeased. He and Daniel had a meeting behind closed doors. There was a lot of yelling. The pressure was mounting. Sterling Hospitality Group had issued a press release announcing their acquisition, promising to honor the bakery's commitment to quality while expanding its reach. They had shareholders to please, a brand image to maintain. A flagship location that couldn't produce its own signature product was not just an inconvenience. It was a financial and public relations disaster. Meanwhile, I was making a new friend at Silver Pines. Her name was Agnes, a tiny, sharp-witted woman who had been a patent lawyer for 40 years. Her children had put her in the home after a fall, and she was bored out of her brilliant mind. We bonded over a shared love of crossword puzzles and a mutual disdain for condescending nurses. One afternoon, I decided to tell her my story. Not the pitiful version everyone else knew, but the true version. I told her everything, right down to the secret recipe book. She listened intently, her sharp eyes missing nothing. When I was done, she didn't offer sympathy. She offered a legal opinion. "This isn't just about a secret recipe book, my dear," she said, her voice crackling with intellectual energy. "What your husband created is a collection of trade secrets, and trade secrets are a form of intellectual property. If they are not explicitly listed as an asset in the contract of sale, they do not transfer with the business. They belong to the creator's heir. That's you. So legally." "Legally," she said, a slow, predatory smile spreading across her face, "you are holding all the cards. They bought a car, but you have the keys, and the engine, and the GPS." She then gave me a brilliant, simple idea. A way to turn the screw to escalate the conflict from a passive waiting game to an active assault. The following Saturday, Alina arrived for her daily visit. She was carrying a large, unlabeled box. "Is this everything?" I asked. "Everything you asked for," she confirmed. "The best butter from the dairy, the vanilla beans from Madagascar, the special high-gluten flour from that mill in the countryside. It cost a fortune." "It's an investment," I said. That night, after the nurses had done their final rounds, I went not to my bed, but to the small, pristine kitchenette that was on our floor. It was meant for residents to make themselves a cup of tea or a piece of toast. It was immaculate and completely unused. I unpacked the box. I took out my husband's book and opened it to a specific page. And then, in the sterile, silent heart of the place I was supposed to fade away in, I began to bake. The familiar rhythmic motions were a balm to my soul. Measuring, sifting, whisking, kneading. The scent of yeast, butter, and vanilla began to fill the hallway, a warm, living aroma in a place that smelled of death and decay. I worked all night, my old skills returning as if I had never left the kitchen. By dawn, resting on the counter were two of the most beautiful things I had ever created: a perfect, golden brown brioche feuilletti and a small, flawless gilded truffle cake. I hadn't just baked a pastry. I had baked a declaration of war. The first person to discover my nocturnal activities was a timid night nurse named Brenda. She followed the scent of melting chocolate to the kitchenette just before the end of her shift and stopped dead in the doorway, her eyes wide with disbelief. The sterile room had been transformed into a miniature patisserie. "Mrs. Thorne," she stammered, What are you doing?" "Baking, dear," I said, not looking up from the intricate lattice of chocolate I was piping onto the top of the cake. "It helps with my arthritis, keeps the fingers nimble." She stared, dumbfounded, at the perfect pastries. She was a kind girl, barely in her 20s, who often spoke sadly of her own grandmother who was in a similar facility miles away. She knew my story, Daniel's version of it. "They're beautiful," she whispered, her voice filled with an almost reverent awe. "They smell like heaven." "This one is for you," I said, sliding the golden brioche onto a clean plate, "for being so kind to an old woman." She looked as if I had handed her a winning lottery ticket. I couldn't possibly. "Nonsense. Share it with the other nurses. A little sweetness makes a long shift shorter." I knew that by sunrise, my reputation at Silver Pines would have fundamentally changed. I was no longer just the sad, discarded mother. I was the woman who could conjure magic from a sterile kitchen in the middle of the night. It was the first small tremor in the earthquake I was building. Alina arrived at 9, looking every inch the respectable librarian on a social visit. She carried a large, empty tote bag. We exchanged no conspiratorial whispers. We simply went to my room where I had the gilded truffle cake carefully packed in a box. "The target is Professor Henderson," I said quietly as I placed the box into her bag. "I want him to have this. It's his birthday next week, and he has been so sad since Michael died. Tell him it's from me, a memory of better times." "And the message?" Alina asked, her eyes glinting. "The cake is the message," I replied. Alina's second stop was at a small, independent coffee house in the trendier part of town. It was the favorite haunt of a woman named Chloe Maxwell, who ran the city's most influential food blog, City Bites. Chloe was young, sharp, and had a reputation for brutal honesty. She had adored the gilded spoon under my and Michael's tenure, but had been suspiciously silent since the acquisition. I had packed a smaller box for her, containing 2 perfect slices of the cake. The attached note was simple. Thought you might enjoy a taste of the real thing. KT. The first explosion was small and personal. Eleanor called me an hour later. "He cried, Catherine," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Professor Henderson. He opened the box and his eyes just filled. He said it was like seeing the ghost of a dear old friend. He took one bite and closed his eyes. He said, 'That's him, that's Michael.' Then he looked at me and said, 'Tell Catherine that a legacy is a living thing. You can't lock it in a cage.'" The second explosion was public, and it was nuclear. Chloe Maxwell posted about the cake that afternoon. Her Instagram feed, usually filled with professionally lit photos of a dozen different dishes, was dedicated to just one. A single, perfect shot of the slice of gilded truffle cake, its layers distinct, its glaze gleaming like dark silk. The caption was a declaration of war on her own. "There are things in this city that are sacred," she wrote. The gilded spoon was one of them. I've stayed silent for weeks, hoping against hope that the new corporate owners would understand what they had. I was wrong. I've tasted their new offerings. They are, to put it kindly, a disappointment. But today, a miracle happened. This slice of cake showed up, a gift from Catherine Thorne herself. And I can tell you this is the real thing. This is the complex, decadent, soul-stirring alchemy that made the gilded spoon a legend. The body may have been sold, but the soul is clearly somewhere else. And wherever Catherine Thorne is baking, that is the real gilded spoon. The rest is just a cheap knockoff. The post went viral within the city's food community. It was shared hundreds, then thousands of times. The comments section was a flood of outrage and nostalgia. "They ruined it. Bring back Catherine. I knew it tasted different." My name, which had been a footnote in my son's press releases, was suddenly the topic of conversation all over town. I had become a cause, a symbol of artisanal quality against corporate greed. Maria's report that night was breathless. "You are a genius, Catherine." "A beautiful, evil genius." She crowed. "The phone has been ringing off the hook. People asking if we are selling the real gilded truffle cake. Customers have been coming in, showing the staff Chloe Maxwell's post on their phones and asking why our cake looks like a sad brown puddle compared to hers. Daniel has been stomping around the kitchen all day, his face the color of raw liver. He fired the head corporate chef this afternoon. And Sterling. He was here. He showed up in a car bigger than my apartment. He and Daniel were in the office for an hour. I couldn't hear everything, but I heard Sterling say, "This is a brand management catastrophe. You told me you had your mother under control." And then he said something that made my blood run cold. He said, "Get me that book, Daniel, or our partnership is going to have a very serious problem." The call from Daniel came the next morning. I was in the common room, calmly working on a 1,000-piece puzzle of a tranquil Japanese garden when the receptionist brought me the phone. "I need to see you," he said, dispensing with any pretense of a greeting. His voice was a low, furious growl. "Why, Daniel, what a lovely surprise," I said, my voice as placid as the pond in my puzzle. "Is something wrong? You sound upset." "I am on my way. Do not go anywhere." He hung up. Agnes, my lawyer friend, who was sitting across from me pretending to read a newspaper, peered at me over the top. "The little prince sounds cross." "He's about to get a lesson in constitutional monarchies," I replied, fitting a piece of the puzzle into place with a satisfying click. He arrived 20 minutes later, striding into the serene, beige common room like a thundercloud. He had clearly rushed from the city, his tie was loosened, and a vein was throbbing in his temple. Several of the other residents looked up from their knitting, startled by this sudden intrusion of raw, angry energy. He marched right up to my puzzle table and slammed his hands down on it, scattering the loose pieces. "What do you think you're doing?" he hissed, leaning in close, his voice a venomous whisper. I looked at him, then at the scattered puzzle pieces, and then back at him. I raised a single, quizzical eyebrow. I'm doing a puzzle, dear, or I was. It's a very challenging one, all that green. Don't play dumb with me. He seethed. The cake, the food blogger, you're trying to sabotage me. Sabotage, I said, affecting a look of deep maternal concern. I reached out and patted his hand. Daniel, you look exhausted. You're not making any sense. What cake? The cake you baked. The one you sent to Chloe Maxwell. You're turning my own customers against me. You're trying to ruin the business. Oh, my little baking project, I said, as if just remembering. It's just a hobby, something to keep my hands busy. You know, I was getting so terribly bored here. And the little kitchenette they have is just darling. It was no trouble at all. Did you know Mrs. Higgins down the hall used to be a home economics teacher? We've been having a lovely time swapping recipes. I was deliberately creating a narrative for him, a plausible, infuriatingly domestic one that he couldn't disprove. I was just a lonely old lady, finding comfort in a familiar pastime. How could that possibly be sabotage? His face was a mask of pure frustration. He knew I was lying, and he knew he couldn't prove it. He was trapped between my performance of sweet senility and the hard, cold reality of the public relations nightmare I had created for him. Where is the book, Mom? He finally asked, his voice dropping, the rage replaced by a raw, desperate plea. Where is Dad's recipe book? Mr. Sterling, he needs it. The business needs it. The book, I said, tapping my chin thoughtfully. Oh, that old thing. I think it's in storage, dear. With all the other, what did you call it? Clutter. I smiled at him, a sweet, vacant smile that did not reach my eyes. It's such a shame. I'm sure it would be very useful right now. But you were so insistent that I not have a lot of possessions here. So minimalist, you said. He stared at me, his jaw working silently. The hunter was now the hunted, and he was beginning to realize the nature of the trap he was in. He had stripped me of my home, my business, my possessions, believing he was leaving me with nothing. But in doing so, he had untethered me from everything he could possibly threaten. The only thing of value that remained was the one thing he couldn't find. This is not a game, he said, his voice low and menacing. Isn't it? I replied, my smile fading. I looked him directly in the eye, dropping the facade for a brief, chilling moment. You made the first move, Daniel. You sold my life's work and put me in a cage, expecting me to die quietly. You underestimated me. You always have. You saw me as the sentimental heart of the business. You never realized that the heart is the strongest muscle in the body. I leaned back in my chair and picked up a puzzle piece. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'm rather busy, and you've made a terrible mess of my garden. He stood there for a long moment, defeated and fuming. He looked around at the other residents, who were all now openly staring at him with undisguised disapproval. He was the villain in their afternoon drama. With a final, choked sound of pure rage, he turned on his heel and stormed out, leaving the scent of his expensive, panicked cologne lingering in the air. Agnes waited until he was gone. She reached across the table, picked up a puzzle piece, and fitted it perfectly into place. Checkmate, I believe, she said with a dry, satisfied smile. Not yet, I said, looking out the window as Daniel's Tesla screeched out of the parking lot. That was just the opening gambit. Now he'll go back to his master. And Mr. Sterling is not a man who likes to lose. My prediction proved correct. The next move came not from Daniel, but directly from the top. 2 days later, a crisp, formal letter arrived from Sterling Hospitality Group's legal department. It was a cease and desist order. It accused me of trademark infringement and unfair competition. It claimed that by baking and distributing items associated with the Gilded Spoon brand, I was illegally trading on their goodwill and causing material harm to their business. It demanded that I immediately stop all baking activities and refrain from making any public or private statements about the quality of the products sold at their establishment. If I did not comply, they would pursue immediate legal action. It's a scare tactic, Agnes said, reading the letter over her spectacles in the quiet of my room. They're trying to bully you into submission. They have no real grounds here. You're not selling anything. You're a private citizen, baking in a private residence and giving gifts to your friends. They know a lawsuit would be a public relations disaster for them. Giant corporation sues grieving grandmother for baking a cake. But they're betting that the threat alone will be enough to frighten you. They're betting wrong, I said, though my hands trembled slightly as I held the heavy official paper. It was one thing to outmaneuver my son. It was another to be in the crosshairs of a multi-million-dollar corporation. So what do we do? Elinor asked, her face tight with worry. She had brought me the letter during her daily visit. We do exactly what they don't expect, Agnes said, a familiar, strategic glint in her eye. We respond formally, politely, and we push back. With Agnes dictating and Elinor writing, we drafted a reply on a piece of silver pines, cheerfully floral stationery. Our letter was a masterpiece of polite, passive-aggressive defiance. It began by expressing my deep confusion over their letter. It stated that I was merely a retired woman enjoying a personal hobby in my new home. It went on to say that I was flattered, though surprised, that my humble home baking was being compared to the output of their esteemed commercial enterprise. Finally, it ended with a sentence that was pure Agnes. While I have no intention of ceasing a pastime that brings me such simple, personal joy, I can assure you that I have no desire to compete with a brand of your scale. Indeed, given the profound and publicly noted differences in the quality of our respective products, I trust that the discerning consumer will have no difficulty telling them apart. That last line, Elinor said with a whistle, is like putting a velvet glove on a brick and then hitting them in the face with it. Precisely, Agnes purred. We sent the letter. The ball was back in their court, and while we waited for their next move, I escalated my own campaign. I didn't stop baking, I expanded my operations. Word had spread through Silver Pines like wildfire. The residents, who had little to break the monotony of their days, were enthralled by my story. I was their resident rebel, their Robin Hood of the retirement set. They became my willing co-conspirators. Mrs. Higgins, the former home economics teacher, helped me organize the kitchenette. Mr. Chen, a retired engineer, figured out how to slightly modify the oven for better heat distribution. Several ladies who missed their own kitchens formed an assembly line, chopping nuts and zesting lemons. My little acts of defiance became a community project. We weren't just baking pastries, we were baking hope. We were a troop of elders who had been put out to pasture, reminding the world and ourselves that we were not done yet. We had skills, we had wisdom, and we were not invisible. The distribution network grew. It was no longer just a leaner. Brenda, the night nurse, would take a box of warm scones with her at the end of her shift to share with the doctors at the local hospital. Mr. Chen's son, a university professor, would take a batch of my lemon tarts to his departmental meetings. Each pastry that left Silver Pines was a message, a delicious little piece of propaganda that spread the story of the real gilded spoon. The bakery, meanwhile, was hemorrhaging customers and staff. Maria reported that 2 of our best junior bakers had quit, refusing to work with the cheap ingredients and the soulless, factory-like methods. The morning queues, which used to stretch out the door, had dwindled to a trickle of tourists and unsuspecting new customers. The regulars, our lifeblood, were gone. They were getting their fix elsewhere, or waiting for a delivery from the Silver Pines underground. Daniel was becoming a ghost in his own company. Sterling had installed one of his own men, a ruthless efficiency expert named Henderson, as the new general manager. Daniel was now just a figurehead, the son of the founder, a useful piece of marketing who was otherwise ignored. He was trapped. He had made a deal with the devil, and the devil was now collecting his soul, piece by piece. He tried to visit me again, a week after the legal letter had been sent. This time, he was a different man. The anger was gone, replaced by a pale, hollowed-out desperation. I agreed to see him, but not at the puzzle table. I met him in the visitor's lounge, a horribly decorated room with plastic plants and uncomfortable chairs. "Mom," he began, his voice raspy. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. "Please, you have to stop. You're destroying everything." "I'm baking, Daniel," I said calmly. "I'm not destroying anything. You, on the other hand, sold a masterpiece and are now angry that you can't reproduce it with a paint-by-numbers kit." "Sterling is going to sue me," he whispered, his eyes wide with fear. The contract had a clause, a guarantee of intellectual property. I signed it, assuring him that all proprietary recipes and formulas were included in the sale. He says I misrepresented the assets. He's going to ruin me. He's going to take everything. The money from the sale, Fiona's house, everything. Ah, the truth, finally. This wasn't about his father's legacy or the good of the business. It was about fear. He had been outplayed by a bigger shark, and now he was terrified. For a fleeting moment, I felt a pang of pity for him. My son, my foolish, greedy, terrified son. But it was a shallow pity, quickly submerged by the cold, hard reality of what he had done. "That sounds like a very serious problem, dear," I said, my voice devoid of sympathy. "You should have read the contract more carefully." "I need the book, Mom," he pleaded, his voice cracking. He was actually begging now. "Just give me the book. We can make a copy. They'll never know. We can put everything back the way it was." "The way it was?" I asked, a bitter laugh escaping me. "You mean with me in my home, with my life's work intact, with my husband's memory respected? I don't think you can put things back the way they were, Daniel. You burned that bridge. You sold your father's soul for money, and now you're upset that the devil has come to collect. This is a mess of your own making. You can lie in it." He stared at me, his face crumbling. The arrogant businessman was gone, and in his place was a lost little boy who had made a terrible, terrible mistake. He had made his choice. He had chosen the cold, hard world of Jonathan Sterling over the warm, loving world his parents had built, and he was now facing the consequences. I stood up. "I'm very tired, Daniel. It's almost time for my nap." I walked out of the room, leaving him sitting there, a captain on a ship he had already sunk, finally realizing that the iceberg he'd hit had been me. As I walked away from Daniel, leaving him a collapsed and broken man in that soulless visitor's lounge, I felt not triumph, but a profound and hollow sadness. This was my son, my only child. I had won the battle, but the victory felt like ashes in my mouth. He had made his bed, as I'd told him, but I was the one who had woven the sheets. I didn't go to my room for a nap. Instead, I went to find Agnes. She was in the garden, a place she rarely frequented, sitting on a bench and staring at the perfectly pruned, passionless roses. "He's broken," I said, sitting down beside her. "I heard," she replied, not taking her eyes off a particularly flawless blood-red bloom. "The walls in this place are made of paper and regret," he was begging. "He's terrified of Sterling. He's going to be ruined." "As well he should be," Agnes said, her tone sharp as broken glass. "He made a calculated business decision to betray his family. It turned out to be a bad decision. In my world, that's just called a loss. You write it off and you learn from it." "He's my son, Agnes." She finally turned to look at me, her sharp, intelligent eyes softening for a moment. "I know, my dear. And that is the unfortunate, messy complication in an otherwise beautifully executed legal maneuver. So the question is, what is your endgame here, Catherine? Revenge is a dish best served cold, and you've served him a veritable ice sculpture of it. But what happens after the ice melts?" It was the question I had been avoiding in the quiet, lonely hours of the night. What did I actually want? Did I want Daniel to be financially ruined, his marriage to the vacuous Fiona in tatters? Did I want to see the gilded spoon, my life's work, crumble into bankruptcy under Sterling's inept ownership? I had proven my point. I had demonstrated my value, but what came next? "I want my bakery back," I said, the words coming out in a raw, honest whisper. "I want my home. I want my son back, not the man he has become, but the boy I raised." "The first two," Agnes said, turning back to the roses, are matters of legal and financial negotiation. The third, that is a matter for a higher court than I ever practiced in. That afternoon, I received an unexpected visitor. A sleek, black car, even more imposing than the one that had brought me here, purred to a stop outside the main entrance. A chauffeur opened the door, and out stepped Jonathan Sterling. He didn't storm in with the impotent fury of my son. He entered Silver Pines with the calm, chilling poise of a general surveying a battlefield. He was not here to yell or to threaten. He was here to negotiate a surrender. He asked the receptionist to inform me that he was here, and he waited patiently in the same uncomfortable visitor's lounge where Daniel had just fallen apart. I took my time. I smoothed my dress. I combed my hair. I took a deep, steadying breath. Agnes patted my hand as I stood up to leave. "Remember, my dear," she whispered, "you are not the supplicant here. You are the queen. He has come to your court." I entered the lounge. Sterling was standing by the window, looking out at the manicured garden, his hands clasped behind his back. He was perfectly tailored, perfectly composed, a monument to corporate power. He turned as I entered, and his face was a polite, unreadable mask. There was no anger, only a cool, professional assessment. "Mrs. Thorne," he said, his voice a low, smooth baritone. "Thank you for seeing me. May I say you have become a very difficult woman to get a hold of." "I've been rather busy," I replied, taking a seat and gesturing for him to do the same. "I've found that retirement offers a surprising number of opportunities for new hobbies." He allowed a small, cold smile to touch his lips. He sat down opposite me, his posture perfect, his movements economical. "Indeed. Your hobby has caused my company a significant degree of brand erosion. Your son's projections for first quarter revenue, on which our acquisition price was based, have turned out to be optimistic." "My son is a very optimistic young man," I said. "It seems to be one of his primary character flaws." "The situation is untenable, Mrs. Thorne," he said, getting straight to the point. "We own a bakery that cannot produce its most famous and profitable items. The brand's reputation for quality is being systematically dismantled, not by a competitor, but by its own founder. It's a novel problem, I must admit." "And you are a man who solves problems." "I am," he agreed. "So, let us be frank. You have the recipes, I have the business infrastructure. It would seem we are at an impasse. However, I believe there is a solution that could be mutually beneficial." I waited. This was the moment, the negotiation. "I am prepared to offer you a consulting contract, Mrs. Thorne," he said, his eyes fixed on my face, gauging my reaction. "A very generous one. We will hire you as the official guardian of the legacy. We'll issue a press release. It will be a story of reconciliation, of tradition and innovation joining hands. You will return to the bakery, work with our chefs, and teach them your husband's techniques. You will hand over the recipe book, of course, as a sign of goodwill. In return, you will receive a handsome annual salary. You could move out of this facility and into a comfortable apartment of your choosing. We would even build a small, state-of-the-art test kitchen for you in the bakery, a place for you to continue your experiments." It was a brilliant move. He was offering me a gilded cage. He would get what he wanted, the recipes, the control, and he would neutralize me as a threat by co-opting me. I would become a smiling, grandmotherly mascot for his corporate machine, a willing participant in the sanitization of my own legacy. He would have my knowledge, and I would have a comfortable salary and a cute little test kitchen. I thought of Michael. I thought of his flour-dusted hands, his passionate arguments with suppliers over the quality of their butter, his belief that baking was not a science, but an act of love. Putting him, his memory, his book, into the hands of this man felt like a final, unforgivable betrayal. "No," I said. The word hung in the air between us. It was so quiet, so absolute, that it seemed to stun him more than a shouted refusal would have. His polite mask twitched. A flicker of genuine surprise showed in his eyes. "I beg your pardon." "The answer is no, Mr. Sterling. My husband's legacy is not for sale. It is not for hire. And it is certainly not going to be a department in your corporation. I will not be your mascot. He stared at me, his composure finally starting to fray at the edges. Mrs. Thorne, with all due respect, you are an old woman in a retirement home. I am offering you a golden parachute. You should be taking it. You see me as an old woman, I said, leaning forward, my voice low and fierce. And that is why you have already lost. You and my son, you see the world in terms of assets and liabilities, of contracts and bottom lines. You don't understand that some things, the most important things, have a value that cannot be quantified. You don't understand the power of a memory, the loyalty of a community, the love that is baked into a loaf of bread. You think you bought a bakery. You bought a building with ovens in it, and it is worthless without me. He was silent for a long time, his jaw tight. The mask was gone. I was now seeing the real man, the predator who was not used to his prey fighting back with such sharp teeth. What do you want, then? He asked, his voice clipped and harsh. Here it was, the endgame. Agnes's words echoed in my mind. You are the queen, he has come to your court. I want to buy it back, I said. He actually laughed, a short, sharp, incredulous bark. Buy it back with what? The profits from your bake sale. I have my own resources, I said calmly, though my heart was hammering against my ribs. It was a bluff, but a calculated one. And I have investors. This part was true. In the past few weeks, as my story had spread, I had received quiet feelers from some of the city's old money families, people who valued tradition and had a deep-seated dislike for corporate raiders like Sterling. They were intrigued by my fight. You are not in a position to be making demands, he said, his voice turning ugly. On the contrary, I replied, standing up. I was in complete control now, and we both knew it. I am in the only position that matters. Mr. Sterling, you have a choice. You can cut your losses and sell me back the hollow shell of a business you were tricked into buying, at a significant discount, of course, to reflect its now diminished value. Or you can continue on your current path. In which case, I will not only continue my hobby, but I will formalize it. I will find a small kitchen. I will start a new, small bakery. I will call it Catherine's Kitchen, or something equally charming. And I will take every single loyal customer that the Gilded Spoon ever had. Your multi-million-dollar investment will be bankrupt within a year. Your shareholders will be furious. And your reputation as a savvy businessman will be in tatters, destroyed by a grandmother in a retirement home. The choice is yours. I walked to the door. You can show yourself out, I said. And please send my son a message for me. Tell him I'd like to discuss the terms of his severance package. The weeks that followed were a blur of intense, around-the-clock activity. My little room at Silver Pines was transformed into a war room. Agnes, invigorated by a real legal battle for the first time in a decade, was my chief strategist. Alina was my communications director, fielding calls and managing my schedule. And I, Catherine Thorne, the grieving widow, had become the CEO of my own resurrection. Sterling, true to his nature, did not capitulate easily. His lawyers sent back a series of blustering, threatening letters, but it was all posturing. The damage to his brand was real and ongoing. His stock price had taken a small but noticeable dip. The story of the bakery rebellion had been picked up by a national news outlet, and the narrative was not flattering to him. He was a corporate Goliath being brought to his knees by a slingshot-wielding granny. Meanwhile, my quiet feelers for investors had borne fruit. A wealthy old philanthropist, who despised Sterling for a hostile takeover he had pulled on a friend's company years ago, saw an opportunity for both a sound investment and a delicious dose of revenge. He agreed to back me, providing the capital I needed to make a serious offer. We entered into formal negotiations. It was a brutal, drawn-out process. Sterling's lawyers tried to nickel and dime us on every point, fighting over the valuation of every oven and every mixer. But they had no leverage. The value of the business was intrinsically tied to me and my husband's book, and they had neither. Finally, after 3 agonizing weeks, we reached a deal. I would buy back the business, the building, the equipment, the name, for 60 cents on the dollar of what Daniel had sold it for. It was a fire sale price, a public admission of his catastrophic failure. The final piece of the puzzle was Daniel. I had refused to speak with him throughout the negotiations. All communication went through our lawyers. My terms for him were simple and non-negotiable. He would be bought out of his remaining shares in the company for a nominal sum. He would have no future role, no title, no involvement of any kind. And he and Fiona would have to vacate the family home they had so eagerly moved into, a house that was technically owned by the business. He was to be cut out completely and surgically. I knew, through the lawyers, that he had fought it. He had pleaded, he had raged. He had tried to appeal to my sense of maternal duty, but I held firm. For him to ever have a chance at redemption, he first needed to experience the full and unmitigated consequences of his actions. He needed to hit rock bottom. The day the final papers were signed was gray and overcast, the sky the color of dishwater. We met again in a sterile law office, a different one this time, my law office. I was there with Agnes and Alina and my new investor. Sterling was there with his team, and Daniel was there alone. Fiona, it seemed, had not been willing to stand by a man who was no longer a millionaire in waiting. The signing was quiet and tense. When it was over, Jonathan Sterling stood up, gave me a curt, professional nod that was a universe away from his initial smug condescension, and left without a word. He was a man who knew how to cut his losses and move on. Only Daniel remained, sitting at the long, polished table, staring at the signature on the paper that had just signed away his birthright. I walked over to him. He didn't look up. "It's done, Daniel," I said softly. "I know," he whispered. "You won." "There are no winners here," I said, and I meant it. I looked at the broken man who was my son, and my heart ached. "You lost your way. You let greed and ambition and that awful woman whisper in your ear. You forgot who you were. You forgot who your father was." He finally looked up at me, his eyes red-rimmed and filled with a despair so deep it was terrifying. "What do I do now, Mom? I have nothing. Fiona left me. I have no job. I have no home. I have nothing." "That's not true," I said. "You have a chance to start over, to figure out what kind of man you actually want to be without money or status to hide behind." I reached into my purse and pulled out an envelope. I slid it across the table to him. He looked at it, confused. "What's this?" "It's a check," I said. "It's not a lot, but it's enough for a security deposit on a small apartment and a few months' rent. A loan, not a gift. And there's a business card in there for a man who owns a trucking company. He's a friend. He's looking for drivers. It's hard work, long hours. It doesn't come with a fancy title." He stared at the envelope as if it were a snake. The sheer, brutal come-down from his lofty ambitions was a physical blow. A truck driver. "Why?" he choked out. "After everything I did, why are you helping me?" "Because you are my son," I said, my voice thick with a love that felt ancient and painful and unbreakable. "And a mother's job is not to shield her children from the consequences of their choices, but to be there to help them stand up again after they fall. You have fallen, Daniel. Hard. Now it's time to see if you have the strength to stand up. The real work starts now." I left him there, sitting alone in the silent, empty room with the envelope that held his last, and only, chance. Walking out of that law office and into the drizzling rain was like waking from a long, terrible dream. Alina put an arm around me. "It's over, Catherine. You did it. You got it all back." "Yes," I said, turning the collar of my coat up against the cold. "I got the bakery back. Now I have to see if I can get my life back." The first day I walked back into the Gilded Spoon, as its owner was a day I will never forget. Maria had gathered the entire staff, the loyalists who had stayed through the dark times. As I pushed open the familiar glass door, they erupted in a cheer that was so loud and so full of love that it brought tears to my eyes. The place was a mess. The corporate regime had left its gray, soulless mark everywhere. The warm, buttery yellow walls had been painted a sterile, institutional white. The comfortable, mismatched wooden chairs had been replaced with hard, modern plastic ones. The whole place felt cold and unwelcoming. It smelled not of baking, but of bleach. "Well," I said to Maria, after I had hugged every single employee, "it seems we have some work to do." And we did. The next few weeks were a frenzy of restoration. We repainted, we reupholstered, we brought back the old comfortable chairs from storage. We threw out all the cheap, corporate-supplied ingredients and restocked our pantry with the best local butter, flour, and eggs. We scrubbed the scent of sterling out of every corner and replaced it with the familiar, life-affirming aromas of yeast and vanilla and melting chocolate. I took my husband's book out of its hiding place and placed it on its own special stand in the kitchen, open to the page for our signature sourdough. It was the heart of the bakery, and it was finally back where it belonged. Slowly, cautiously, the old customers began to return. Professor Henderson was the first, walking in on the morning we reopened, his eyes scanning the restored room with a look of profound relief. He took a bite of his almond croissant, closed his eyes for a long moment, and then nodded, a single, perfect tear rolling down his cheek. "He's back," he whispered. "Michael is back." The story of our victory, of the community's bakery being reclaimed from the corporate giant, became a local legend. Business was better than ever. We were no longer just a bakery, we were a symbol. But amidst all the joy and the hard work, there was a constant, quiet ache in my heart. Daniel. I had not heard a word from him since the day I had given him the envelope. I didn't know if he had taken the job, if he had found an apartment, if he was even still in the city. The not knowing was a special kind of torture. Then, one rainy Tuesday afternoon, about 6 months after the reopening, the bell above the bakery door jingled. I looked up from the counter where I was boxing a cake for a customer. A man was standing there, dripping wet, his shoulders slumped. He was wearing the simple, dark blue uniform of a delivery driver. It took me a moment to recognize him. He was thinner, his face was leaner, and his hands, the hands that had once signed multi-million-dollar contracts, were calloused and rough. It was Daniel. He didn't say anything. He just stood there, looking around the bakery, at the happy chatter of the customers, at the warm glow of the lights, at me. I finished with my customer, my hands shaking slightly. I walked around the counter and approached him slowly. "You're getting soaked," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "I was making a delivery nearby," he said, his voice quiet and raspy. I wanted to see it." He looked at me and his eyes were clear for the first time in years. The fear and the arrogance were gone. In their place was a deep, weary sadness, but also a flicker of something new, something like peace. It looks like it's supposed to," he said. "It does," I agreed. An awkward, heavy silence fell between us. "What do you say to the son who tried to destroy you?" He cleared his throat. "The job is hard," he said, "but the guys are okay. They don't care who my father was. They just care if you can back a trailer into a tight spot." He looked down at his rough hands. "I'm paying my own rent. I'm making my own meals." "It's quiet." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a worn, slightly crumpled envelope. He handed it to me. "It's the first repayment on the loan," he said. "It's not much, but it's a start." I took the envelope. It was thin. Inside was a small amount of cash. It represented hours of hard, physical labor. It was probably the most honest money he had earned in his entire adult life. "Thank you, Daniel," I said. He nodded, and then he did something that stunned me. He reached out and he hugged me. It was not the confident, possessive hug of the son who thought he owned the world. It was a hesitant, almost fragile embrace. The hug of a man who was lost and was just beginning to find his way. "I'm sorry, Mom," he whispered into my shoulder, his voice thick with tears he was trying to hold back. "I am so sorry." I hugged him back, my own tears finally falling, hot and cleansing, onto the rough fabric of his uniform. I held my son, my broken and beautiful and foolish son, and I knew in that moment that the ice sculpture of my revenge had finally, completely melted away, and what was left was the warm, messy, and unconditional love that had been there all along. The bakery was back. But this was the real restoration. This was the true homecoming,